Good morning, everyone. How exciting it is to be here with all of you today. I offer you the warmest welcomes, everyone, to this gathering of those old-fashioned creatures, human beings. Welcome. I'm Stephen Blackwood. I'm the president of this fledgling college, Ralston College, and my colleagues and I are all very, very glad to have you all here. From near and far, from across the ocean, from across the country, from here in beautiful Savannah, for what we hope is a special, memorable, and deeply human day. We hear a lot about the coming AI revolution. Maybe it has already come, some will say. We're told that massive disruption is coming, indeed is already here. And that, on top of the enormous changes that have already taken place fairly recently in human history, that is to say, over the past 50 or 100 or 200 years, developments, it is not at all clear we human beings have really learned to live with, to catch up with yet. And yet, on top of all that, now comes a further machine revolution in the form of AI. What are we to do? That is really the question we are asking today. We're a humanities college, Ralston. We're not involved in building these technologies, but we are involved in thinking about what the human being is, how we understand the status and character of our lives. So this day is in fact not about the machines, but about us. I think we, certainly I, have been learning the hard way. Indeed, it appears there may be no other way to learn, about how hard it is to live in relation to the machines, to ever expanding, ever more convenient, ever more computationally powerful, and ever more seemingly anticipatory machines. I did a very informal and non-scientific straw poll recently in which I asked a handful of friends who were sort of all around my age or old enough in any event, several of them are here, to remember before the iPhone. You know, some of you remember those days, those halcyon days when humanity was in its early stages. And I just asked them, do you think your life is better or worse now than it was before the iPhone, for all the incredible things it makes possible? So much ease and getting around and all these things. Better or worse? Everyone said worse. I mean, what are we doing and how do we live in relation to what we are doing? None of that is, of course, to question the power, the genius design, or the usefulness of machines, but rather simply to point to the very challenges for human beings of living in relation to them. Ian Forster's stunningly prescient "The Machine Stops," a reading recommended by our chancellor, gives us a prophetic image of life lived entirely through the machine, underground in artificial light, where face-to-face human contact has all but ceased. But the thing is, I don't think I'm the only one who was struck reading that. To a large degree, that is the world we already inhabit. So in the end, while it's an extremely interesting question that we will revisit today of what the machines can and cannot do, or will not be able to do in the future, so far as we think we understand them, it obscures the more important question for us, and that is, what must be ours? What must we do to be fully human, to live lives of purpose and meaning, to live the one life we have as well as we can? There are all kinds of things we can depute to machines, and indeed to other human beings. But the one thing, by definition, that you cannot depute to anything or anyone is your own life. No one else can find your place in the cosmos for you. No one else can take your acts of cognition, love, conscience, conviction, forgiveness, creation. But how best do we live amidst the siren song of ever more powerful, ever more seductive machines at our seeming command, and amidst an already struggling civilization, out of touch with its grounding myths, traditions, ideals, and with our own civic life under ever-increasing strain, fragmented all too often by the very algorithms that seem to have taken on a life of their own. So today then is not about the machines, but about us, about the irreducibly, inalienably human. How do we defend, protect, understand, and realize that in ourselves and in others? In short, this day is about the battle for the soul. There's perhaps no one who has a more powerful critique of the grasping, instrumentalizing approach to our world than the man we are very proud to have as our Chancellor, Dr. Iain McGilchrist. But what makes this doctor so special and beloved by so many of us in this room is not critique, simply, trenchant though that critique is, but because his diagnosis already contains the remedy. A recollection of ourselves, a showing of a higher way of seeing and being, of finding ourselves within the whole. And so it is with Jonathan Pageau, too, whose work has done so much to help many find themselves in the paradigmatic patterns of the real, and especially through the myths that are a way of that finding. We are in, I know, for some inspiring and illuminating talks by both of them. We also have the great fortune today to be joined by the renowned mathematical physicist and computer scientist, Stephen Wolfram. We wanted to make sure the day did not even accidentally straw-man technology. And Dr. Wolfram is at once a uniquely accomplished technologist and, in an age of reduction, a champion of the ultimate irreducibility of reality itself. I'd like to thank, before we kick off, the Hochman Family Fund for their support of this gathering, and above all, Ben Delo, a really visionary philanthropist who has sponsored this event, a man of uncommon clarity about the existential importance of freedom of thought. It's quite a day, I think, we're in for, one that only we, frail and fragile, but also curious and conscious and resilient, old-fashioned beings can bring into being.
What exactly is AI? Whatever it may be, I know this. It never gave birth to a new life, never mourned the loss of a beloved partner, never knew joy in the world and yet grieved over its fragility, never saw a beauty that scarified its heart, never fell in love and yet lived to see that love falter, never suffered and had to contemplate its own death, never felt intimations of something inexpressibly great and grave that spoke only to its soul. For it has neither soul nor body, those two elements which together, interpenetrating one another, constitute the entirety of human existence here on earth. As Wittgenstein said, the human body is the best picture of the human soul. AI can have as much information as you like, but what could it ever understand? What does it mean to know? Really to know? Isaiah Berlin, describing the tenets of Enlightenment thinking, refers to the three propositions upon which the whole Western tradition rested, namely, that all genuine questions can be answered, that if a question cannot be answered, it is not a question, that all these answers are knowable, that they can be discovered by means which can be learnt and taught to other persons, and that all the answers must be compatible with one another. When Berlin refers to the Western tradition, he's speaking of the Western philosophical tradition, that is, that part of Western culture dealing in explicit fashion with the resolution of questions and answers. Although philosophers in the West, since the time of Plato, but importantly, absolutely not before, have behaved as though these tenets, Berlin's three propositions, were true, there was, until the time of the Enlightenment, enough implicit expression of cultural wisdom through the media of poetry, drama, painting, and above all, religious ritual, in all of which it is easily perceived as far from true that all questions can be answered, that all questions can be answered and their answers taught to others, and that all the answers are mutually compatible. These tenets, though espoused by philosophy, had not come to shape the culture itself, but with the heightened self-awareness of the movement called the Enlightenment, and which the great physicist-philosopher David Bohm called the Endarkenment, these three obviously false propositions came to dominate not just academic philosophy, but the business of life itself. Or, to look at it another way, in what became known as the age of les philosophes, we all became philosophes malgré nous. AI is an expression of this very unusual way of thinking, in which information aspires to replace meaning, to replace, by mimicry, knowledge, intelligence, and understanding. In every language I know other than English, a distinction is made between two fundamentally different ways of knowing the facts of the case, so to speak, and knowing from experience. In French, for example, savoir is used to denote the first kind of knowledge and connaître the second. Thus, I know, savoir, that Paris is the capital of France, but I know, connaître, Paris because I lived there for several years. Similarly with wissen and kennen in German. The first is a kind of propositional knowledge, knowing that, as opposed to having knowledge of. In other words, the first remains in an abstract conceptual realm which is wholly unlike reality, rather a mere and meager representation of reality. It is like the glaring simplicity of a map contrasted with the almost infinite complexity of the world that is mapped. Another way of putting this difference is that between knowing about something from the outside and knowing it intimately from the inside. Going back to Berlin's summary of Enlightenment thinking, fairly obviously, only knowledge from the outside is the kind that can be written down and handed to another in such a way that the other receives the knowledge whole and intact. If you ask me to tell you about a person I love, I can give you a description, mentioning a number of facts about her, but that will get you almost nowhere in understanding who she is. For that, I'd have to say, you really must meet her. She is a unique, embodied being, an embodied soul. We are very impressed by AI's apparent knowledge, but this can only ever be knowledge from the outside. It is effectively just a very rapid file retrieval system entirely parasitic on the fruits of human experience. Even when it appears to understand in a more rounded way, by anticipating and mimicking a human emotional reaction, it has merely moved its conceptual knowledge to a new target, not in any sense knowledge of, but information about, human knowledge of. In this process, everything that matters has been elided. The meaning has been emptied out, and it is only in our reception into the lived world of whatever the machine emits that meaning is restored once more. I'd like to make some brief reflections on the words body and soul, since they're not as straightforward as they may seem. First, the body. This too comes into being for us in more than one way. The right hemisphere of the brain, as one can tell from the fascinating changes that occur after unilateral brain damage, is responsible for our sense of the body as something we live, something that is part of who we are, and which is, if I can put it that way, the phase of intersection between ourselves and the world at large. With the right hemisphere suppressed or functionally ablated, by contrast, the body is something from which we are relatively detached, a thing in the world alongside other things, devitalized, effectively a corpse. As Gabriel Marcel puts it, it is sometimes as if I am my body, sometimes as if I have a body. Some languages, such as German, see the body in these two senses as so distinct that they have different words for them. Leib for the body I am, Körper for the body I have. Incidentally, the German word Körper, related to the English corpse, came into the language through medicine and theology, the body there being the element left when the soul departed. The word Leib, related to Leben, to live, referred to the bodies that survived a battle, those who are not Körper. In fact, even more striking is that the Greek word, which subsequently came to indicate the body considered separately from the person, soma, is never used in Homer to refer to the living body, only to a corpse. In my early training as a doctor, the emphasis was on the body seen as the thing that we have. In my practice as a doctor, above all as a psychiatrist, I was returned once more to a vivid awareness of the body as something we live. Then, what is perception? To the detached intellect, it is a mass of information registered by the senses, whatever they are. But it is nothing less than the seamless flow of something coming into being through a process in which our emotions and the body which is their home, our memories, the whole of our unconscious life, past and present, is brought to bear. The lived and living body is where meaning resides. And that is, I hardly need to point out, something AI doesn't have. And then there is the soul. The soul here already plays a part, since in this world, body and soul can never be fully separated. Soul is an old-fashioned word that threatens to disappear from our vocabulary, and therefore from our vision of human reality. But it cannot be replaced by any other word whatsoever, not by the mind, the intellect, the heart, the moral sense, though clearly all those aspects of our existence are connected to what we mean by the soul. It seems to place the person in the widest context, a context outside the confines of immediate time and space, and it involves a sense of destiny. So when in that dramatic moment when Othello realizes that his wife has been, as he thinks, unfaithful to him and is ready to put out the light, he says, "It is the cause. It is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, ye chaste stars. It is the cause." Now, when he says, my soul, he doesn't mean my mind, my heart, my moral sense. He means my soul. And then there is that mid-Victorian or late Victorian poem by W.E. Henley called Invictus, which so much inspired Nelson Mandela during his imprisonment. And it ends, "It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." Not my mind, not my heart, not my moral sense, but my soul. And then, in a different register, there is, as so often, a wonderful passage in Wordsworth from the Tintern Abbey Ode, in which he refers to that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breaths of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. When I was a teenager, probably the most significant thing that happened to me in a wonderful education I was offered was one day when one of my teachers sat me down and played to me Tallis's Lamentations. I'll never forget it. And that music, I got to know the music of Palestrina, Vittoria, Tallis, Bird, and so on. Yes, it has its intellectual elements. Of course it affects your emotions in a way, but that's an utterly trivial way to describe it. It speaks directly to the soul. And the Franco-Romanian philosopher Emil Cioran, who said that were it not for the music of Bach, God's whole creation could be considered a mistake, described Bach's music as a ladder of tears in which our longings for God ascend. This is not computation. This is not abstraction. This is the very place at which body and soul meet and take us on our journey up that ladder of tears towards God. The philosopher Eugene Gendlin said, "We think more than we can say. We feel more than we can think. We live more than we can feel. And there is much else besides." Perhaps the soul is what we mean when we reflect on that much else besides. What is meant by the soul in all that has gone before, and indeed what is meant by the body, is something that only experience of being human can possibly help you understand. And that brings me to the question of what is meant by understanding, and its near neighbor, intelligence. Though they're not quite the same, they have much in common. Fatally for the Enlightenment project and fatally for AI, neither of them can be simply proceduralized so as to be inserted in another person. Indeed, intelligence could be seen as the opposite of following procedures. Following rules is known as diligence. By contrast, intelligence is always and only demonstrated in going beyond the rules. It is necessarily embodied, not purely abstract. It deals with the implicit, the unspoken, what is more, the necessarily unspoken, as much as the explicit. The word intelligence comes from the Latin roots inter and legere, that is to say, reading between or among. This can be understood in more than one sense. It means reading between the lines, as we say, hearing what is not said, what is merely implied, as much as what is boldly stated. It means taking into account many possibilities at once, including possibilities that appear to be incompatible, without projecting any of them until a fuller picture has come into being. Reading between and among. Intelligence is not just seeing connections, but relationships, which are much more than mere connections. It sees Gestalten, that is to say, wholes that cannot be decomposed into their parts without substantial loss. And importantly, it is characterized by insight, whether in art, science, or mathematics. Insight is a faculty that, once again, cannot be operationalized and refuses to be commanded at will. For example, there are procedures for manipulating symbols. These are the principles of mathematics. And there is the fabled scientific method, which proceeds logically, step by step, towards an, at least in theory, predictable conclusion. But as the stories of all the great discoveries in both mathematics and science demonstrate, no amount of following laws and procedures produces insight. And it is only in that moment of insight, dependent on the right superior temporal sulcus and gyrus, that intelligence brings us to something entirely new, which can then be grasped by the left hemisphere and added to the heap of what we call information. George Gaylord Simpson, one of the most influential contributors to the reigning modern synthesis in genetics, and therefore by definition as mainstream as they come, observes, the scientific method quite ignores the most difficult, most creative, and most important elements of scientific endeavor. How does one discern a problem, or decide what kinds of questions are to be asked? How does one determine what observations are relevant, and especially what kind of hypothetical solutions are acceptable, and where do they come from? Perhaps the most cogent objection of all, he says, is that important basic research has seldom really followed the scientific method as it is stated. In other words, you can't even start on the scientific method without making assumptions, using judgment, and having insights that are not part of the method and do not follow any kind of formal principles, and the method is in any case unlikely to produce important results. Science in practice is often driven by hunches and initially somewhat vague impressions. For a start, science depends on good hypotheses. Not only is there nothing wrong with that, but it is essential to the nature of science that it imaginatively selects its assumptions, which it discards only when they don't work. But science could never get off the ground if untold numbers of fruitless hypotheses had to be taken equally seriously and subjected to the same procedure so that they could be systematically eliminated. It therefore requires the exercise of imagination from the outset, which alone can supply interesting and potentially fruitful hypotheses and eliminate intuitively unfruitful ones. While respecting the data out of which they emerge, good hypotheses always go beyond the immediate facts, as some scientists are constantly harping on. I'm told that my work goes beyond the facts. I'm rather pleased about that. I sort of feel it would be rather odd if Galileo had stopped it going, crikey, that planet's not in the place I thought it was going to be. Never mind, I wonder what's for dinner. I'm off home. No, he saw what was implied and saw well beyond the facts into a reconception of the cosmos. And as the biologist Peter Medawar wrote, scientists should not be ashamed to admit, as many of them apparently are, that hypotheses appear in their minds along uncharted byways of thought, that they are imaginative and inspirational in character, that they are indeed adventures of the mind. Intelligence then can never work by rote. It is creative and requires the judicious exercise of imagination. And then there is understanding, otherwise known as comprehension. Comprehension is not apprehension. It is taking the world as a whole, not taking hold of the world. The idea that, as we saw, is embedded in the Latin root interlegere is also, appropriately enough, embedded in the Germanic roots of our word understanding. The element under in the word might be at first sight puzzling, but the word wunder in Middle English still had the sense among, preserved in modern German, where one can say unter Freunden, among friends. It therefore had within it the idea of being situated among a range of ideas, experiences, memories, intimations, a field of connections out of which meaning could arise. Once again, imagination needs to guide our choice. There is no predetermined formula for how to do this. And then there is wisdom. What can I say about that mysterious and worryingly rare entity? Like all that truly matters, it has to be approached apophatically. That is to say, by our being clear about what it is not. People sometimes say to me, you seem to think that we as a society are lacking in wisdom. So tell us, how can we develop more of it? I fear they want me to say something like this. We should above all define our terms, delineate our goals, determine achievable criteria that can be measured, perhaps set up committees that meet once a month and produce a report every 6 months on progress achieved so far. In the light of that report, we then update our criteria and develop an algorithm that will lead people closer to wisdom. But wisdom is, of course, the ultimate case of something for which there are no rules, which cannot be written down in a form that can be taken in by another person or a machine, and is beset with paradox, as all the great truths are. I don't just say that. Niels Bohr said that, the greatest of the modern physicists. It is a hard-won side effect, wisdom, of a long, disciplined and thoughtful life. No AI has a snowball's chance in hell of achieving it. Traditions from the East are the most fruitful place to go if one was looking not for worldly success, but for wisdom. But to the Western mind, their teachings can be frustrating. They do not recommend actionable projects, such as accumulating more and more information, like AI, or doing more and more, like busy executives, but cultivating not knowing and not doing. Certainly not setting up committees governed by procedures and obsessed with statistics that are the proof of success. I should clarify here that not knowing is not by any means the same as ignorance, nor is non-doing the same as idleness, rather the opposite. The great German 20th century thinker Josef Pieper called busyness the true idleness. He pointed out that having the discipline to make use of freedom so as to think carefully and with due caution, to be both scholarly and creative, is what makes a culture. From the perspective of the neuroscience of the hemispheres, the literally less intelligent, literally less perceptive, frankly delusional, quick and dirty left hemisphere has, for perfectly good evolutionary reasons, developed so as to think it knows what it does not know, and to be ready to go do something on the basis of its mistaken beliefs. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere, seeing the big picture, looking before and after, is what the celebrated neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran calls the devil's advocate. One that is always seeing the possibility of something else that the busy, hasty left hemisphere has simply overlooked. No, ignorance is what comes before knowledge. Not knowing is what, if we're lucky, comes after. Similarly, non-doing is an important preparation for wise action. You'll not find it as one of the courses of action recommended by a machine. This is because we imagine that whatever happens in this world originates from and is initiated by ourselves, and so we've trained machines to conform to this idea. But we've forgotten that, as D.H. Lawrence wrote, we are transmitters. We are transmitters. And in this simple phrase is compressed much wisdom. We need to get out of the limelight and stop getting in the way of a wisdom that comes to and through us, not from and out of us. We can't do anything to prevent death, but we can do much to prevent life by blocking its path or crowding it out with our clever plans. We don't originate life, but have the sacred responsibility to transmit it and help it flourish. The gardener cannot make a plant, can't even make it grow. All he or she can do is tend to the plant and encourage it in a direction of its own making, or fail to do so. We are gardeners, not gods. And we're gardeners of our souls. We're not the source, but that which flows from it. I am a Taoist, by the way, entirely compatible with being a Christian. I'm a Taoist, and according to Taoism, it is wise to discern the direction of the Tao and follow it, not attempt to obstruct it or divert it where we think best. And our task is to be a vehicle for something beyond us, behind us, above us, before us. How do we do that? Well, non-doing is what I would describe in an intentional paradox as active passivity, an opening of our being towards what is, in which we are attentive and ready to lend ourselves to a process not of our making. Our relation to what is ought to be a relation of extreme responsibility, custodianship, answerability to and for. For this, we need receptivity to cultivate what George Steiner called audition. The stance or disposition, he wrote, that we need to adopt, according to Heidegger, is one of waiting on something, rather than just waiting for it. Man is only a privileged listener and respondent to existence. The vital relation to otherness is not, as for Cartesian and positivist rationalism, one of grasping and pragmatic use. It is a relation of audition, We are trying to listen to the voice of being. End of quote. This receptivity is vital in the true sense of the word, for without it there is no life. All that is continually coming into being through a process of calling and answering between what is in us and what is greater than us, each calling to the other, a relation of resonance, reverberation, response, and responsibility, in which we co-author reality. We don't make it up, but neither is it there entirely as though we didn't exist. Before there are things, there are relations. Relations come before relata, the things that are related. Nothing is just out there inert and lifeless. It keeps coming into being for us as it encounters our rapt attention. And the quality of that attention matters, because how we attend changes the nature of the world that comes into being, the only world we can know. Here I would note just two of many distinctions between the cerebral hemispheres. The first is this: what presence is to the right hemisphere is merely represented to the left. The verb to presence is a translation of Heidegger's Anwesen, and the implication is of something not merely being present in some sort of passive sense, but positively coming into being for us, becoming. Representation, on the other hand, means something being present again, when it is actually no longer present. In other words, it is a lie. Whatever it is no longer coming into being for us, but fixed, no longer imaginatively alive. It has neither body nor soul, become nothing more than a concept. The relevance of this is that AI is the export into the world outside ourselves of the modus operandi of the left hemisphere. And it has neither body nor soul, but only concepts. The second hemisphere distinction I want to draw attention to concerns the all-important question of value. The overriding value, arguably the only value, of the left hemisphere, the reason it evolved to be what it is that of utility, power to control, manipulate, and utilize the world. In fact, one way of looking at it is as the embodiment of the drive for power. It therefore conceives, makes, uses, and delights in tools. The logical extension of this drive is the machine, a tool that can make other tools. And AI is a tool. At any rate, it started out as one. But it is both a tool and the projection into the external world of that drive towards limitless power. To be clear, when I say the embodiment of a drive, I am indeed implying the existence of forces, attractors, teloi in the cosmos that long antedate and transcend ourselves. One definition of evil is that it reduces the human to a passive machine. So said the great Hannah Arendt. This is where we're going in a new, frighteningly literal sense. Nothing, according to the drive behind the machine, should be impossible. As Hannah Arendt put it, a distinctive feature of radical evil is that it isn't done for humanly understandable motives, such as self-interest, but merely to reinforce totalitarian control and the idea that everything is possible. This is the Luciferian power, the force that in its origin was good. Lucifer was indeed chief of all the angels, the light bearer. But through resentment of anything superior to himself, he came to desire the destruction of all that is good and true and beautiful. This myth, which is the great theme of Milton's Paradise Lost, speaks to us now more than ever. I believe there are forces at work that we do not fully comprehend, some of them driven by a lust for destruction, for its own sake. I think we can see this happening around us in the last few years more markedly than ever before. In the Epistle to the Ephesians, we find the words, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world." I'm not a great fan of St. Paul, but I do think that he was very wise when he said those words. At the beginning of part 3 of The Matter with Things, I recount a myth of creation from the Onondaga people. The Onondaga belong to the Iroquois nation. It tells of a benign creator God who, as the light fades in the universe, needs to bring into being, for the sake of the whole cosmos, the earth and all its creatures. But he has a resentful younger brother of a jealous disposition whose attempts to create produce only things that are ugly, misshapen, barren. This brother is consumed with envy of the beautiful and fruitful creatures that his brother has made and does his best to destroy them. Effectively, he will not accept anything that he himself has not made. The whole story would be worth recounting if there were time. It has many levels and is rich in its insights into the nature and the relation of good and evil. The point I must confine myself to drawing attention to today is the refusal of all that has not been made by ourselves, and a sort of rebellion against all that is natural and good. In The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt wrote, "For some time now, a great many scientific endeavors have been directed towards making life also artificial, towards cutting the last tie through which even man belongs among the children of nature." And that was some 70 years ago. The resentment of nature, the attempt at every turn to bring her down and destroy her, is the consummate evil of our age. The desire to destroy everything we have not made ourselves. I was going to say with our own hands, but that too sounds now too natural. It's no longer good enough that we made with our hands, but at last only with our machines. And here's the thing. When harm comes to us, the destruction is always, without exception, presented as something benign, a great step forward, something that is offered to us as a boon. So it is that we welcome the Trojan horse into our midst. Tyranny is always presented as a power for you, not the power that will be used over and against you. As the mechanistic systems get more powerful, we become situated more and more as passive and childlike, and we not only allow them to infantilize us, but we do all we can to encourage them. This is foolish in the extreme. We must push back. We're not as fragile and impotent as we're made out to be. This is a culture in which vulnerability and victimhood bring status. But we do people a great disservice when we lead them to believe that they're endlessly vulnerable. We all have an extraordinary capacity for resourcefulness and resilience if we allow ourselves to recognize it and embrace it with courage. Yuval Noah Harari, I felt a shiver go down my spine, who calls us hackable animals and recommends that we get used to it. recently told the WF in Davos in a summit in January, artificial intelligence is the new master of words. It will take over language, law, and power. Most of the world of the mind will originate in a machine. AI has coined a new word for humans, the watchers. Note that, the watchers. And he concludes, AI machines can lie better than humans. You bet. So, of course, what could possibly go wrong? What I believe we have created in AI is not something that has intelligence, not something that can understand, but something that lays itself open to be used by intelligences that we cannot perhaps understand, and whose aim is power to control, but also to destroy all that they themselves have not created. This is a story to be found deep, enshrined in ancient myths from all around the world, because it's not dependent on the adventitious elaborations of our own technological culture, but reflects the deep structure of the world, whether we recognize it or not. You might well think that the fact that the machine cannot suffer or die is a strength, but it is not. The psychiatrist and philosopher Viktor Frankl, many of whose family died in the Nazi death camps, and who narrowly escaped from them with his own life, had deep wisdom. He reflected that suffering is a great teacher, and more than that, even one of the ways in which a life is fulfilled. Not something pridefully to be sought out, but something to be accepted at last as a gift. He saw too that resistance overcome brings meaning that could come by no other conceivable route. In other words, there is a paradox at the heart of the cosmos. But when did anyone wise imagine that the truth was straightforward, single, and simple? Oh yes, the philosophers of the Enlightenment, forgot about that. The truth is bound up with paradox. Of this I am certain, and no machine can ever begin to understand this. Bounds and bonds speak of limitation, bounds and bonds. But it is through our bonds, paradoxically, that we are made free. The bonds we hold to one another, the bonds we acknowledge with nature, and the sacred bonds that assure us of our place in a cosmos that is, strange to say, our home. So, metal is not everything, but let the iron enter into our souls.